Peace, y'all. This is Marcus Sunjata Brown coming to you with the fourth installment in my Kwame Nkrumah series. So in the last video, we talked about the contradiction that opened up between the CPP, led by Kwame Nkrumah and consisting of the masses of African people, and the United Gold Coast Convention, which mostly represented the African middle class or the African petty bourgeoisie. And the fact that the UGCC leadership preferred a more gradual, go slow approach toward independence versus Nkrumah's base, which wanted a complete and more rapid independence than what the UGCC was calling for. Okay, so in January 1950, Nkrumah called for what are called the positive action campaigns, which were nonviolent forms of mass protest. At the same time, there were a number of strikes going on in the country with the African trade unions. So the colonial governor was very nervous about the situation between the positive action campaigns, which were patterned largely on the Gandhiist model, and the autonomous trade union struggles and push toward a general strike that potentially could have crippled the Gold Coast economy. So the governor called a state of emergency and had Nkrumah arrested because, once again, the colonialists don't understand what makes history, believing that charismatic or powerful individuals are the real makers of history, and that if you strike them down, then you will get rid of the masses' desire to be free. But this only enhanced Nkrumah's prestige with the masses of African people. Okay. A related point that I want to make here, and that refers back to an issue that we discussed in the past, was that Nkrumah was a revolutionary. But a lot of people think that because the positive action campaigns that he called for were nonviolent or quote unquote patterned on the Gandhiist model, that this meant that he was not a revolutionary, in fact, that he was simply a reformist. We already alluded to some of the problems with that conception in a previous video where we talked about not only his involvement as co-secretary of the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which did state that force could be used if necessary to win independence for African people, but also that he was surreptitiously involved in organizing a revolutionary group called the Circle, right? So Nkrumah was a revolutionary. However, he was concerned with the fact that on the continent, there weren't really that many avenues for armed insurrection, armed revolt to actually be successful. Remember, this is before the Cuban Revolution. This is before Vietnam. This is even before the Algerian liberation struggle properly got off the ground. So there weren't that many models for successful third world armed insurrection and guerrilla warfare against the European powers. Okay, but I do want to read a quick statement from an anthology of Nkrumah's works called Revolutionary Path, where he clarifies why he preferred the positive action method at this time. Okay, so he says, referring to a pamphlet that he wrote around this time, he says, "In what I mean by positive action, I called for nonviolent methods of struggle. We had no guns, but even if we had, the circumstances were such that nonviolent alternatives were open to us, and it was necessary to try them before resorting to other means." Okay, so what Nkrumah is saying here is that if we could win our independence with as little bloodshed as possible for African people in particular, but for all sides involved, then why not use that approach? Okay, and his anxiety at this time rested in the fact that the British government was transitioning away from a labor government, which would have been more amenable to a peaceful concession of independence than the conservative government that appeared to be gaining power. And the UGCC was taking a very go it slow approach to independence that would have probably mired the Gold Coast in, say, another decade plus of colonial status. Okay, so this is why he was pushing for the positive action campaigns that ultimately led to his arrest. All right. At the same time, Nkrumah's popularity grew with the masses of African people while the CPP was organizing among, the peasantry and the workers of the countryside. So in 1951, there was a series of national elections, which were really decisive for what direction the independence movement was going to take over, the next decade. And in the 1951 elections, in which Nkrumah from jail ran for the legislature, the CPP was wildly successful. It was the most successful group by far, outstripping the UGCC and everybody else. Okay, so the new governor, Arden Clark, who was, slightly more liberal than the outgoing governor, who was responsible for a number of violent repressions that really caused disfavor back home in the metropole. Governor Arden Clark called Nkrumah to form a government. Okay, so he's leaving prison. And now he is head of government, or head of a transitional government leading up to independence. Okay. In the next video, I'll talk about what some of the problems with this transition actually were in terms of the economics and the political structure of the colonial government that the CPP inherited. Okay. Now, Nkrumah was still opposed, okay, by a group called the National Liberation Movement, which was the official opposition to the CPP, right? And this group was mostly composed of the chieftains and the petty bourgeois elements that lost out in the national elections, okay? So if you recall, I did mention that the tribes, or some of the larger tribes like the Ga Ashanti, had tighter connections with the colonial mother country than Nkrumah and his family had. Okay, so these groups were interested in retaining this kind of relationship with the British, even into independence. Okay, so for this reason, they preferred a federated to a unified form of government for the Gold Coast in its independence. Okay, that way each of the separate regions of the Gold Coast could negotiate their own relationship with the British, kind of how the secessionists in the Congo would try to make their own relationship, which would have been an exploitative relationship in like the Katanga province, for example, with the Belgians. Okay, so for this reason, the tribal politics, as well as the professional petty bourgeois strata, are or were really dangerous for the possibility of a unified national government that would have been able to effect considerable changes for the entire Ghanaian nation, or what would become the Ghanaian nation, right? But these elements were unable to stop the motion of destiny, right? So in 1957, Nkrumah was able to formally declare the independence of the Gold Coast. March 6, 1957, the Gold Coast was renamed Ghana. In the next video, we'll talk about what some of the challenges as well as the successes of the Ghanaian nation state under the CPP were, and the contradictions that led up to Nkrumah's coup in 1966.